Hello and a very warm welcome to another edition of World Panorama, the only show that gets you a weekly roundup of all that's happening in the international arena. I'm Sana Khan. Our top story this week is the continuing, in fact, the worsening crisis in Syria. Activists say the death toll from infighting between rival Islamic rebel groups in eastern Syria has jumped to 68 in a single day. This being the latest episode in a relentless cycle of blood and violence that has gripped the country since March 2011, when the uprising against Assad's rule began. Thousands of fighters have been killed in rebel against rebel violence that intensified beginning of the year, particularly in the northern and eastern parts. What's worse is that the United Nations has warned that a looming drought in Syria could push millions more into hunger and exacerbate a refugee crisis caused by the 3-year conflict. Syria's breadbasket, northwestern region, has received less than half of the average rainfall since September, and if it stays dry up to wheat harvest time in mid-May, the country that's already reliant on aid for millions of people will need to import even more food. Now let's have a look at this report first, and then we'll get on talking about what exactly is the situation there.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
Death toll from the fierce infighting between rival Islamic rebel groups in eastern Syria has risen to at least 68 fighters, an opposition group said. The Britain-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said battles are still raging on Friday for a second day around Bukamil town. On Friday, Syrian fighters opposed to the rule of President Bashar al-Assad took control of a strategic area in Quneitra province in the southwest of the country.
نحن لواء المدينة المنورة قمنا بتحرير التل الأحمر الغربي مع الفصائل الأخرى قام حصاره تقريبا أكثر من شهرين.
On Wednesday, 21 people, including women and children, were killed by twin car bomb attacks in the central Syrian city of Homs. 107 others were left wounded by the blasts. UN Human Rights Chief once again called for the situation in Syria to be referred to the International Criminal Court.
Both the Commission of Inquiry and my office, which has our own monitors, have consistently pointed to human rights violations by both sides. But you cannot compare the two. Clearly, the actions of the forces of the government far outweigh the violations. Killings, cruelty, persons in detention, disappearances, far outweigh, so you cannot compare the situation. It's a government that is mostly responsible for the violations, and all these perpetrators should be identified and can, if there's a referral to the International Criminal Court.
Syrian UN Ambassador Bashar Jafari dismissed Pande's accusation against Syrian government forces as false and lacking credibility because Pande and UN investigators had not visited Syria during the conflict.
She just listens to reports coming from what she calls the camps of the Syrian refugees in the neighboring countries, where many, of course, opponents are in these camps. So she is manipulating, bluffing the truth, and she is biased. She is using her position, very important and sensitive position, in favor of making further pressure on the Syrian government.
Syria's conflict began 3 years ago with largely peaceful protests calling for reform and later for Assad to be toppled. Al-Qaeda-linked groups with foreign fighters in their ranks have played an increasingly prominent role, dampening support from the West. Overall, more than 150,000 people have been killed in the past 3 years.
All right, to get a perspective on what really is happening in Syria and why have international efforts really failed to bring peace in the country even after 3 years of turmoil, I welcome Savita Pande. She's professor at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, on the show. Thanks so much for joining me again on the show. Let me start by asking you, what's your perspective on the present situation? You know, what about the international efforts? Where is Lakhdar Brahimi?
Well, the international pressures have not worked in case of Syria as apart from the other Arab Spring. countries, you talk of Libya, you talk, all these countries, you had this effect of, because there was no other power which was very seriously interested. And in case of Syria, interest of Russia in particular, for the UN to play a proactive role, or any role for that matter, was stopped because of the very physical presence. There have been historical relations dating back to the Cold War days, and on the Trotos, they are physically present, they have a base there, and they would not allow anything. Some hopes had come up after the chemical weapons threat was expressed, and the Russians intervened directly, and they said that they would be destroyed, and they are in the process of helping them destroy, to be honest to them. And also the Americans, the Americans have a very peculiar problem in the region. They cannot support Assad, and they cannot support the rebels either. The rebels themselves, there is no unified bloc, but there are groups which are supported by Al-Qaeda, which are very actively. So, it's between, and the statement which Obama made, where he very clearly said that it is, after Afghanistan and Iraq, is there any point in years of military fighting in Syria where last 3 years have really brought no result at all? Both Geneva 1, Geneva 2 failed. So, this is a place where you really have a conflict of interests working, and that is why the things are where they are today.
I'll ask you about what could possibly be the solution now, when so many efforts have already happened and they failed as well. But you referred to the Russia intervening when, in case of, they decided that the US was about to strike militarily on Syria, and Putin intervened and he said, let's just remove the chemical weapons there first, and then the Ukraine crisis happened. So you think international focus really diluted at that point of time from Syria, but the situation still continues to be as worse, perhaps even more worse than what it was a couple of months back?
No, certainly, the infighting among the rebel groups was not there, the kind of infighting and the violence that has happened, especially in this week itself. But the Russian, what happened in Ukraine had an indirect effect, and that is the Russian assertion of its foreign policy, that we are not power number 2, we can directly intervene, and where our large interests are there, we will intervene. Even now, the military threat that looms over Ukraine at large, and American helplessness, let us say, they made brave sound, but they couldn't do anything about it. So, Russian assertiveness in Ukraine and, preventing an attack in US, in Syria, are part of a larger Russian policy, which is seen of a proactive interventionist policy.
So, would you agree with some analysts when, I've been reading up articles which say that what happens now in Ukraine will directly impact what happens in Syria?
Definitely, because it affects the power of the country called Russia, and the kind of support which Putin got, after what happened in Crimea. Domestically, he was facing tremendous domestic crisis also, and it came as a big help, So, you will find a proactive Russia, and let me also put this thing, the Iranians are there, the Chinese are there, they all have worked as forces working towards or along supporting the Russian interests. And therefore, I think that it is going to have an impact. The Russians are going to be stronger than they were before.
Okay. Talking about Iran, when Hezbollah really entered Syria for the first time about a year ago, things were very different. The status quo was very different, and there were talks of how Assad's regime is eventually going to fall soon, but that really hasn't happened. So, can we see the gameplay changing from here on and the tactics changing? Because
most certainly. You see, why Geneva 1 and 2, especially 2, failed? Because there is no way Assad is going. You see, the lip service, at best they could have said re-election, which would have brought Assad back. The rebels put their foot down in February talks, and therefore, Assad is stronger than before. In international politics, we cannot definitely say that he will never go under no circumstances, nothing. But as things stand, he is stronger than when people will say they will have to find replace what they were calling a national unity government, which should come to replace him, which is not happening, seem to be happening at the moment. So things have changed for a while. Equations have changed between US and Iran also. Equations have played with the active role of Jordan, of Iraq. You know, all these countries get affected, Turkey. All these countries get directly affected. So, it is not what the other Arab Spring countries were, as I said in the beginning, and therefore, today Assad is stronger than he was some time back.
Okay. Now, let me also quote some statistics going back to what's happening within Syria. You know, the UN's refugee agency has announced that the refugees, they've topped about 1 million, half of them are children. And that's really devastating. The war has uprooted 9 million Syrians from their homes, 2.5 million of them live, you know, in neighboring countries now. So, on the ground, the situation is really bad. Do you think perhaps the United Nations can be more assertive at this point in time and take some concrete measures, or will all the efforts really amount to nothing?
It will be difficult. See, UNHCR and all can play a role only in the humanitarian context. You know, not only US, but even Europe, France for instance, which were earlier interested in a proactive role, now has said that there has to be a political solution. The Chinese have said very, very clearly they will oppose any interventionist move, and that they think that political solution is the only way. The simple is that, you know, if the crisis spills over, if the crisis enlarges, it is going to affect direct interests of many countries, including China, where 80% of oil comes from Middle East, you know. And so, you know, it will not be easy. Yes, the crisis is immense, terrible that children have got affected. It is a war-like situation. I would say it is worse than a war-like situation where the civil war has almost ensued. But only role at the moment the UN can play is, you know, humanitarian, which even the European countries are doing. But directly intervene to, you know, regime change and all are just no in Syria.
Okay. And I also want to bring back to your attention, you know, how the focus is shifting away from Syria. What will it take now to bring the focus back on Syria? The talks have failed. There was a lot of media coverage about Geneva 1, then Geneva 2, but now in the near future, we have no milestone, nothing to look forward to for the Syrians, you know, in terms of any peace agreement, some resolution, nothing in sight.
Well, you know, it has to be between the big two, the US and the Russians. You know, even when the chemical weapons talks were taking place, even the Chinese took a backseat, saying that we would not allow military intervention. And so, military intervention, as I said, is really not possible. It has to be eventually the talk between the big two. Who will bend before, who will accept the other's condition, that remains to be seen. The Russians are in no mood to let Assad go, or if, you know, even if in figuratively
they cement their position after what's happening in Ukraine.
After what's happening in Ukraine, they have become stronger. As I said, that they are saying that now we are a proactive power in the world. And after what happened in Crimea, you know, there was nothing anybody could do, which is a very powerful thing. And so, it has to be a talk, and the American fatigue. American fatigue in Afghanistan, American fatigue in Iraq, and there is no success with Iran, you know. So, there is absolutely nothing that they can do. They cannot let it continue because of the proactive role of the Syrian Al-Qaeda, Noor groups. These are the groups which are very, very active. So, I think that at the moment the Russians have an upper hand, and therefore, it has to be negotiations where some conditions will have to be given up. Otherwise, it will be, you know, fresh talks and failure of talks.
All right, fresh talks and more failures. Certainly, we don't want that. Let's just hope that some sort of you know, way is opened up and things look much better for the people on the ground, because the situation is really very, very bad. Thanks so much, Professor Pande. It's always a pleasure having you on the show. Thanks so much for joining me. With that, we're taking a very, very short break. Lots more international news is lined up in our next segment. Don't go anywhere. Thanks for staying with us. Ukraine's interim prime minister attempted and failed on Friday to break a tense deadlock in the country's east, where armed pro-Russian protesters have barricaded themselves inside government buildings and demanded independence from Kyiv. Meanwhile, the United States delivered a stern warning to Russia at the World Bank IMF meetings in Washington amid worries that a spiraling Ukraine crisis could hurt the world economy. A report.
Ukraine's acting president promised on Thursday that pro-Russian activists occupying government buildings in the eastern city of Donetsk and Luhansk will not be prosecuted if they lay down their arms. Even as the dialogue continues, the self-proclaimed deputy of People's Republic of Donetsk said that activists are unmoved by Ukrainian authorities' ultimatum.
Ми готові розглянути негайне питання щодо реформи місцевого самоврядування в напрямку розширення прав місцевих рад, в тому числі формування виконавчої влади радами.
As the international community accused Russia of provoking unrest as a pretext for military intervention, Russian President Vladimir Putin reiterated that annexation of Crimea was not pre-planned. That decision was made after opinion polls showed an overwhelming support from Crimeans.
Принято окончательно после того, как стало ясно настроение людей. Мы ведь не готовились к такому развитию событий. И, откровенно говоря, можно было себе представить, что...
Meanwhile, a small group of pro-Russian protesters gathered outside the Council of Europe headquarters in Strasbourg on Wednesday as members of Parliamentary Assembly discussed the escalating tensions in Ukraine. Hundreds of armed pro-Russian protesters occupied Regional Government Administration building in Donetsk and a branch of Ukrainian security service in Luhansk since Sunday. They are demanding a referendum on broader autonomy or even secession from Kyiv.
Much else has been unfolding around the world. Here's a quick wrap of other international news.
6 world powers and Iran will need a lot of intensive work to bridge differences during talks over Tehran's nuclear program, the European Union's foreign policy chief Catherine Ashton and Iran's foreign minister Mohammad Zarif said on Wednesday after their latest meeting. They will begin their next round of talks in the Austrian capital on 13th May. Ashton, coordinating the talks for the powers, told reporters while standing next to Zarif. North Korea announced its young leader Kim Jong-un was re-elected as first chairman of the ruling National Defense Commission at a meeting of its assembly. North Korea's state-run television KRT showed a video of Kim attending a meeting of the first session of the 13th Supreme People's Assembly, which was elected last month, with Kim winning overwhelmingly in his constituency. 23 people were killed and dozens were injured when a bomb went off inside a fruit market in Pakistan's capital Islamabad on Wednesday morning. Later, one of the injured people who had been moved to the Pakistan Institute of Medical Sciences succumbed to his injuries, bringing the death toll to 21. The bomb disposal unit said that an estimated 5 kilograms of lethal explosives fixed in guava crates were exploded by a remote control device. Russia declined several FBI requests for more information on Boston Marathon bombing suspect Tamerlan Tsarnaev 2 years before the deadly 2013 attack, the New York Times reported, citing an unpublished US government review. The information, including a telephone call in which Tsarnaev and his mother discussed Islamic Jihad, would probably have prompted harsher scrutiny of the suspect, the paper said. The Arab League called on the United States to keep up efforts to salvage Middle East peace talks that are on the brink of collapse, blaming Israel for a crisis that has led Washington to evaluate its role in the negotiations. At a meeting of Arab foreign ministers in Cairo, the Arab League said Israel was responsible for the serious predicament facing the negotiations, citing its failure to release about 24 Palestinian prisoners as one of the major causes.
Shifting gears, time to bring you up to speed with all the sports news that you might have missed through this week. Here's all the sports action.
Manchester United's Champions League's exit against Bayern Munich signalled the end of the club's unbroken 19-year run in the competition, with David Moyes set to miss out on playing amongst Europe's elite next season. Bayern dominated the first half Wednesday night but failed to overcome Manchester's well-positioned defence. After the break, the visitors piled on the pressure to shock the Bavarians before Pep Guardiola's men struck back with 3 goals within 17 minutes. South African state prosecutors started cross-examining Oscar Pistorius, vowing to get to the truth surrounding the killing of Pistorius's girlfriend on Valentine's Day last year. Pistorius, who faces life in prison if convicted, said the killing was a tragic error and that he fired after mistaking her for an intruder. Competitors in the Marathon des Sables started the exhausting 2-day fourth stage on Wednesday. The majority of the runners set off early on the 81.5-kilometer leg, while the top 50 male athletes and top 5 women started 3 hours later. The stage, which includes the ascent of Jebel Hills, is expected to take the elite runners less than 10 hours, but it is a grueling journey for the rest, who are allowed a maximum of 34 hours to complete it. Striking workers' construction returned to the work site of Rio's 2016 Olympic Park to continue pressing for higher pay and healthcare, a day after clashing with security guards. The construction workers have been on strike since April 3rd. The construction consortium responsible for the park, which is slated for delivery in the first half of next year, has vowed the strike would not affect delivery dates.
Moving on, here's a look at what's creating a buzz in the world of show business, a look at the latest flicks and news from other arts and entertainment.
The Indonesian martial arts film The Raid has developed a cult following since its release at the Toronto Film Festival in 2011. The film is unusual as it is about an Indonesian martial art and its dialogue is all in Indonesian. The film sees the police rookie hero of the first movie, Rama, return, but this time he wants to take down corruption in the city and plans to infiltrate one of the most ruthless Jakarta crime syndicates. The Raid 2, known in the US as The Raid Berendel, released in the UK on April 11th. Actor Kevin Costner and his Draft Day co-stars celebrate the premiere of the movie in Los Angeles. Set on the day of the National Football League draft, Draft Day sees Kevin Costner play the general manager for the Cleveland Browns, who has the chance to trade for the #1 pick. Sports movies are familiar territory for Costner, who famously starred in the baseball films Field of Dreams and Bull Durham. Adoring fans of the next big British boy band, the Vamps, queued in the rains from 5 in the morning in order to get nearest the stage at the band's single launch party. Fans were treated to a 30-minute set from the band in which they performed singles including Last Night, Can We Dance and Wild Heart. The teenage four-piece is comprised of singer Bradley Simpson, guitarist James McVeigh, drummer Tristan Evans and bassist Connor Ball. As usual, Fashion Rio opened in a stylish burst of radiant color when some of Brazil's biggest designers began showing off their most recent creations. 4 labels in all showcased their new 2015 summer collections on Tuesday at the 25th edition of Rio de Janeiro's premier fashion event. This year's theme is meant to be a blend of all things related to rivers, tropical resorts, world heritage and cultural landscapes.
And that's all we have for you in this edition of World Panorama. For more international updates, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. This is me, Sana Khan, signing off.